we welcome to the stage the director of Mr. Peabody and Sherman, Rob Minkoff, and Mr. Peabody himself, Ty Burrell. Somebody sit down somewhere, please. We're losing the light in here.
We have another hour of credits right after this, so just stick around. There's got a lot of departments to thank.
Yeah, I couldn't feel my legs standing out there after a while.
There are actually, we've counted, there are 1,247 names in the credits.
Mine is listed 1,200 times, so.
Well, nobody stays long enough to see, so who would know? Who would know? What's really fun about this is that all the old Jay Ward cartoons were really always pitched at adults. I mean, in that era where people were starting to, all the big studios were starting to make cartoons for kids, Jay Ward was resolutely making cartoons for adults, and you really wanted to keep that aspect of it, didn't you?
Well, that was his thing, was that you make them for yourselves and that you don't underestimate the intelligence of kids. And I think, I hope you guys liked it, but I definitely feel like I say we, I really mean they, meaning the animators, Rob, DreamWorks, did an incredible job of staying true to the original in that way, in that spirit of being a really smart, funny film.
How many people here, just show of hands, how many people here remember the original? Great. So, how did we do?
No pressure. No pressure.
Wow, I don't know the shameless side of you, Rob. This is really new to me. But I like that because you could easily gone cynical and made it very pop culture. Because in fact, there are lots of sort of like pop culture references in the old Jay Ward cartoons. I first heard about the ruby out of Omar Khayyam in a Bullwinkle cartoon because there's a yacht made of rubies. I guess Omar Khayyam's not really pop culture now.
No, they're slightly more
Omar
archaic.
Khayyam.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I guess I'm showing what era I'm from. But you really sort of kept it, even though it's punny, there's not the kind of puns that throw us out of the movie. That was really engineered that way, was it not?
Absolutely. Well, it's always been a thing for me. I haven't been somebody that loves doing those sort of like contemporary references, those things that sort of date a movie, because that always worries me. So there was a great moment I remember when we were doing Lion King, and we had this idea at the end of the movie. If you've seen Lion King, there's a sequence where
If they've seen Lion King, is that your question?
if you've seen it, there's a scene where
There's a little movie called The Lion King. I'm going to take a minute to explain it to you.
There's a lion.
So the scene at the end when they're going back to Pride Rock, and they have to create a diversion, and Simba turns to Timon and Pumbaa and says, "You got to create a diversion," and then suddenly they do the Hawaiian War Chant, but with kind of funny lyrics. So Timon says, "If you're hungry for a hunk of fat and juicy meat, eat my buddy Pumbaa here, because he is a treat. Coming down to dine on this tasty swine. All you got to do is get in line." And we had this great idea, and we wrote the lyrics for this thing, but that was the Hawaiian War Chant, and we pitched it. And I remember when we pitched it to Jeffrey, Jeffrey said, "Nah, it's got to be Staying Alive." Staying Alive. And I was thinking, you can't be in Africa and be thinking of John Travolta in a white suit. It's just going to take people out of the movie. And so we were sort of nervous because we had a test screening to do. And I knew that if it didn't work, if this joke didn't land, it'd be out of the movie and we'd be doing Staying Alive. And so we got to Pasadena, we showed the movie, and we got to that part, and I'm literally sitting in my seat. I'm like, I'm hunkered down because I'm just hoping, I'm praying that it worked. And sure enough, got a huge laugh. People were like rolling in the aisles, couldn't hear the next few lines of dialogue. And so we got to keep it in the movie. But for me, it was important that if you do jokes, and even that was totally anachronistic to do the Hawaiian War Chant in Africa.
I mean, it's almost like like Danny Kaye, that kind of patter thing in it. So it's that kind of reference.
Yes.
Rather than
So I think that you can push it, but you don't want to break it, right? So
Yeah.
that's for me, I think, the important thing. And I think we do that. Here we push it, but you never want to break it.
I guess I find myself thinking too, because you do a time travel movie, and in the decades since Peabody and Sherman, it's been Back to the Future. So you have to still offer a kind of reality that makes sense to people in the context of time travel fiction, don't you?
Yes.
Why don't you talk a little bit more about that? Please say something.
No, I was just thinking
else.
about Jeffrey being upset with me for telling that story.
He's leaving right now. Oh my God. But I just feel like though that's you want to make because the way back in the old shorts is just kind of this thing that makes this noise, and the next thing you know you're back in time, and you had to sort of create that movement.
Well, yeah. I mean, when we thought about it from the very beginning, we thought it would be fun to do something a little bit more with the time travel. It would be fun to be able to fly through a wormhole, and certainly making a 3D movie gives you kind of opportunities to have fun with that you wouldn't have had if you just opened a door and walked through it.
Which, I mean, because I wondered how much time you guys spent on that aspect of the movie, because it's a really big part of us watching, sort of like the diesel push when their heads get jerked back in 3D, which is really funny to watch twice.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that was really a great part of this, is because we had the freedom also to sort of elaborate and go further than the original show. I mean, I think that was ultimately the big challenge and a big part of the fun of the creation of this, was that we loved the original so much, but that we knew we weren't making a copy of it. We weren't trying to do exactly what they had done. We were trying to do something that would sort of make sense for today.
Well, tell me about finding the voice, because he's a little smug sounding at the very beginning, and I wonder how you figured out a way to sort of do that. So when he actually, the moment after the bite, the voice becomes very different.
Well, I think Bill Scott, who created the voice, was a real genius, in my opinion, and I have a tremendous amount of admiration for him. So I had the benefit of sort of using that voice as a template.
Basically, the most emotion he shows is when he scolds Sherman.
Exactly. It's inherently more glib. It's a 5-minute. They're 5-minute shorts. They're droll. They're really about more. They're more instructive. And one of the great benefits you're just talking about this. There's the visual expansion of having a feature-length film. There's also the emotional expansion of having a feature-length film, which was kind of a cool thing for us to explore, which is even though they established in the very first Peabody and Sherman the adoption.
It's basically almost a throwaway joke, though.
It is. That's right. They never really address it, so we have the luxury of actually we address it in the film. Obviously, you just saw it, but also we have the luxury of kind of exploring the idea of them going from mentor protege, which is really what those shorts are. They're really just
he's almost like his goofy lab assistant and his son.
And what that would really be like over the span with more time, and how they can grow into really being father and son. So that also played a part into the voice. The voice, I really want to pay respect to Bill Scott, so we spent a few of the first sessions really trying to find the middle ground where we're paying respect to Bill Scott, and it has sort of at least some of the precision and that stuff that really kind of like it really indicates the wit of it, but also maybe is a little bit more grounded for the scenes that require it, which are the heart-to-heart scenes between he and Sherman. And that original voice, which by the way, Bill Scott could have done a more grounded voice if he was super talented, but
that was a choice to do it in that way. Were you selling the jokes?
Exactly, and I think that we needed to kind of messed with it for a while, and it took a few sessions.
Absolutely, it was interesting because in the early conversations about the movie, there was some thought about trying to do a Soundalike, and I very quickly thought that was a terrible idea, because I hate it when I hear people doing characters that I know. If I know the character, if I've heard them, it's hard for me to hear someone else doing it, because as good as they might be, as close as someone is to Bugs Bunny, it's not Mel Blanc.
Right. It almost draws up the contrast too much.
Yeah.
By getting
you can hear what's missing.
Right. Yeah.
Exactly. And so we thought, well, if we're kind of bringing this character back, and it's completely in a different form. I mean, it's not the 2D animation. It's not the limited.
Did you ever think about the way trying to make it hand-drawn or 2D? Or was it always going to be computer rendered?
Well, we never really thought about it. People asked me early on if we would do it in 2D, and in fact, they asked if it would be sort of intentionally crude.
Yeah.
like the original shorts. And I was like, well, if we did that, it would end up being a commentary on it, as opposed to sort of keeping it genuine in its own thing. And so I think what we did is really simply decided we wanted to embrace the content of the shows, the content of the characters, the content of the time travel, the content of the crazy historical people, and not worry so much about the form, because the content is what we really loved so much about it. I think the form of it was interesting because that was really born out of a time in the history of animation where budgets were so low, they had no money.
And the voices really did all the work if you think about that, because the animation is so crude.
Exactly. It was all about the writing. It was all about the voices. It was all about that performance. And it wasn't so much about the animation. The animation wasn't like the thing. And you know, so now today you sort of wouldn't think about that unless you really wanted to make something very extremely arch. So, but it was the characters and the comedy and just the premise was so great. It was a brilliant premise. You know, the dog who adopts a boy. The fact that the boy and his dog relationship is turned upside down.
My boy Sherman. That's
yeah. I mean, what's amazing is it's such a strong idea that even though a whole generation of kids have never seen the original show and don't know anything about it, a lot of people don't. The minute they hear the idea that a dog adopts a boy, it's like, whoa, that's amazing, and it doesn't feel 50 years old at all.
Because what I think is interesting too is the idea of creating people around them, because, you know, in one respect, Peabody and Sherman are really lonely. They don't know anybody except people in the past in those shorts. So just the idea of creating a community around them sounds really interesting to me. I want you guys to talk about doing all of that.
Well, I've never actually even thought about that. That's kind of awesome that actually their only friends are people from, I don't know how to feel about that.
Because I even thought about when Sherman's talking about knowing all these people in the past, wait, that makes sense, because in the original shorts, all they did was go back to you never saw them talk to anybody. I think there's one where a pizza was delivered, which became like a reason to go back and see Da Vinci. But other than that, there's never any, this is sad how much time I spent on this. But it struck me as being really interesting, the idea of creating a community around them to give them that grounding you guys are talking about.
That's interesting.
I'm not trying to stop.
No, it's okay. No, I mean, I guess, you know, it's interesting because I don't think we thought necessarily about that. For us, it was about fleshing out the world that they were in. Right. Because what we asked ourselves simply was, well, what was their life like outside of these adventures? Right, because he's a dog and he's a father to this boy, and they live in Manhattan. And what do they do when they're not going in the Wayback? And so asking ourselves those questions sort of helped us flesh it out. And there's the one line in the movie when Sherman says, "Is the president coming to dinner again?" So you figure Mr. Peabody has very important friends.
Right. It really raises the stakes on keeping the time machine working, because otherwise they are just so lonely.
I've given somebody a spring point for a really sad essay about this.
Yeah, exactly.
But I just thought that was great, that the idea, and also you kept the integrity of the past figures being almost like Borscht Belt jokes, like Michelangelo basically sounded like he could be from the radio in the 30s, and that's just really, really funny stuff. And I told you last night, Rob, when I heard Mel Brooks doing the voice of Einstein, I screamed when I heard that. I just thought it was kind of perfect. I thought, there must be a snippet from a 2,000-year-old man record or something. You can't actually be that. So it's just those getting those people, those characters, must have been so much fun for you guys.
Absolutely. Well, that's the great liberty that you have with something like this, because even though it's about history, it's sort of like the kookier side of it, and you don't have to be literal. I do remember we did a screening, and they had a quiet Q&A after it, and they turned to one of the kids, and the kid said, "So is all that history true?" I really wasn't sure how to answer that question. It's like, well, not all of it.
Not any of it.
That's one of my favorite things, though, about the original, or at least watching reruns of the original, is that I think it taught me a lot more about history than I realized. You know what I mean? They're smart enough and they're funny that you don't, even though we're not obviously going to be giving a bunch of fact-based history in an animated film, but you're introducing the idea of history as a story, which I think is such a beautiful thing to give to a kid, that that history is a story, that when they
It's
are
a narrative.
reintroduced to Agamemnon or reintroduced to Da Vinci somewhere down the road, they immediately go to at least an idea of a personality, that there's even the tiniest bit of narrative around it. And I think, when those subjects were brought up, even though, I don't know if I remember that much about the Peabody and Sherman stuff, it helps you to not just think of it as a dry fact.
No, because I thought what was
Yeah.
kind of inspirational about this, I think for me, it kind of spurred an interest in history. Just see
Yeah.
what were these people like?
Yeah.
And I just wonder how, when you guys are working this out, how much of this you want to feel like you want to play fast and loose with. Because I think kids seeing Da Vinci and seeing Agamemnon and seeing, the court of Versailles, and that take on Let Them Eat Cake is a really funny idea.
Right. Well, I mean, everything was researched, and everything was sort of, you had to know the story in order to kind of have fun with it. But that idea, which was, I thought, very interesting, was something that we talked about very early in the development of the movie, was the Marie Antoinette story is apocryphal, right? We said, Let Them Eat Cake. Everyone knows that story because we all hear that story, and it's easy to understand and it's easy to grasp. But supposedly, Marie Antoinette never actually said it. And so that idea was sort of interesting to us because the whole original show was about Mr. Peabody introducing Sherman to these people, and for whatever reason, they couldn't they were on the cusp of their great invention or their great idea or great thought, and they were having trouble actually accomplishing it, and so Mr. Peabody was always having to force their hand to help them along with it, which gave me the impression that Mr. Peabody was responsible for everything that ever happened.
Yeah.
And
The dog shall lead them, yes.
exactly. And so we were thinking about all of that and what does that mean, and would we want to keep that idea of it? And so we sort of struck on this idea, this notion that, history. What is history? History is a story that we're told. We think of it. We want to think of it as fact. We want to think of it as hard fact. We want to think of it as data and information and provable and almost scientific. I think that's the mistake we make when we teach history. We use a kind of a scientific approach to it, which is entirely wrong for the subject. And so, it isn't fact, it is perspective, it is opinion, it is all of these things, and it gets revised, frequently, and people say, well, that's what happened, that's what we think would happen, but it didn't really happen that way, this is what actually happened. And so history is a really interesting subject for that. It's a really kind of a malleable kind of subject. So we brought up that idea that what if things were not always what you expected, or what if the history we're taught isn't always what you thought it was, which is where the Washington story came in when he says, did he, cut down the cherry tree? And Sherman says, no, that didn't happen. It's apocryphal. So that idea, I think, was really fascinating to us, that it's true that in history, it isn't always hard fact.
But Ty, really, because I want to get back to performance of you, Ty, because I do think after that bite, when the voice, the timbre of the voice changes, it becomes really touching. And I wonder how you kind of happened on that, or how much that you worked out.
Well, that was a group thing. That really was. That was probably. What's happening?
I thought it was hallucinating, but there's somebody.
Oh, hi. How's it going? Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you. I love the glasses. I love the whole outfit, actually.
She really worked very hard on this little thing.
Are you dressed as someone specifically, or? Okay. She just explained her mom makes all her clothes, and she wears it all the time.
That's very pretty.
It's really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Ladies and gentlemen.
I guess I
Rosanna
was
Fox.
asking something. I'm distracted now. But again,
Oh yeah, about the voice. It was completely a group thing. I think I came in really trying to get as close to Bill Scott as possible, and it was a relief.
once you got past that initial sort of using that as a launch point,
Yeah.
there are emotional moments that you hit.
Yeah, and it's a relief. It was a relief to kind of realize that everybody was actually after the same thing, which is that this is a bigger story, which I thought was a really cool part of it. I'm an adoptive parent, so I think, the idea of adoptive parents and universal love it's important to me, and the voice ended up really kind of being a big part of the emotional arc of the show, which was a relief to me, because I didn't, as fun as that voice is, I think it would get a little bit
One note.
it would feel a little bit one note over an hour and a half or whatever.
How'd you end up how'd this end up happening with Ty, Rob? How'd you end up?
Well, this was actually, I guess, 3 years ago. So Modern Family was sort of in its early first or second
year.
Second year.
Yeah.
So Ty was actually willing to come in and audition.
I auditioned a couple times.
Which
Yeah.
Today I'm not sure Ty would do that.
I absolutely would.
'Cause things
For Mr.
are-
Peabody, I absolutely would. I really would.
But it's true, if you, depending on who you're after for a particular role, depending on their where they are in the food chain of Hollywood, they may or may not be willing to do that. And Ty was, which was great, because Ty came in, and I think the thing that we wanted, or we thought Ty would bring to the role, was a warmth, and that was actually something that we thought was very important to balance Mr. Peabody's sort of cerebral edginess. That his caustic sort of cold wit needed a beating heart, and Ty had that sort of just in his voice, and that was something that we were really wanting from it. And when we did our first audition, we actually, typically we'll go through these things, and then there's a number of people that will get involved in the ultimate decision. And Tiffany Ward was one of them. And Tiffany Ward is Jay Ward's daughter, and Tiffany has been managing and taking care of the properties of her dad for 24 years. So it's very important to us that she be on board with it. And when she heard Ty's very first audition, she was concerned because she felt that it wasn't quite enough like Mr. Peabody. And so that was hence the second round.
Yeah.
Because we assured her, we was like, Ty's a great actor. He'll get it. Don't worry. He'll be great. And so
I'm glad you didn't ask me. I wouldn't have said the same thing.
So the next session that we had, it was like, let's talk about Mr. Peabody, let's talk about Bill Scott and the original show, and let's kind of try to find a little bit of that in the thing, but never to try to be an impersonator of that, never to try to copy it, but to try to make it his own, and to try to understand kind of getting at the character through a kind of objective, thing about there's a cadence in Mr. Peabody's voice which sort of helps define him as a character. And it was, after the next session or two, I can't remember, but very quickly, you couldn't hear anyone else playing the part, literally. And even Tiffany was like, he's great. He's now Mr. Peabody. And to prove the point, I actually we created a piece of film, which I think which you've seen, actually recorded, which was, we started on the original short. We started on the 2D, Jay Ward short of Peabody and Sherman, and then we took the camera and pulled it back from the screen, and you see our Sherman, the modern Sherman from the movie, watching the screen, and he says, "Gee, Mr. Peabody, they look awfully familiar." And then our Peabody, played by Ty, said, "Well, that's us, Sherman, from 1959. And then Sherman says, "But if that's us, who are we?" And so just having the two of them literally in the same piece of film, hearing Bill Scott's performance and then coming out and hearing Ty and saying, this is the same, this is Mr. Peabody. It's just sort of the other side. And it's almost like, the way the way an actor would say, well, that was me in a TV show.
Well, before this gets way more philosophical, let's thank Ty Burrell and Rob Minkoff for being here.
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry to hang that up.